Welcome to the Passion for Patients podcast. I'm Tonya Winders, your host and the president and CEO of GAAPP, the Global Allergy, Airways Patient Platform. Together with our 130 plus patient organizations, we are striving to ensure that those living with allergic, atopic, and airways diseases live better and breathe better. Today on the podcast, we have our VP of Education, Kristin Willard, here with us, and we're going to continue a conversation that we started on strategic planning. Thanks for being here, Kristen.
Thank you so much for having me for this great topic.
Yeah, so much to talk about that this ended up being 2 podcasts. So if you haven't tuned in to hear part 1, please do so. But we want to continue on to this topic because I do think it is foundational. It's fundamental to really getting your member organization, your NGO, off to the best start each year. Having a good, solid plan, knowing where you're going is absolutely essential, right? So we talked about some of the tools that we have, some of the basics of who should be involved. But now I want to turn to the challenges, because anytime I've gone through a really productive, good strategic planning process, there have been challenges. So what are some of the challenges that you faced?
I love the way that you phrase that, because I think it's really important that we normalize having challenges, right? To get to the good outcomes, you are going to have challenges. And if you have all of the innovative, bright thinkers in the room, as you should for this kind of project, you will have challenges, right? But understand that that is part of the process, and don't let that be too daunting for you. So when I was preparing for this, I was thinking about it in terms of 2 buckets almost. And the first one will be challenges that you experience when you're creating the strategic plan, and then challenges when implementing, I think. And those are important, I think, both important. The first that I would touch on when creating, which also happens when you're implementing, if we're honest, are conflicting priorities.
Oh, yeah.
And the people are nodding around the world, right, who have done this before.
Yes.
With that many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak, you're going to have people who have different ideas about what your organization should prioritize. Yes. And part of that exercise is walking through this, being very deliberate about it, right? Being very intentional, listening to those different viewpoints, and then determining the best steps forward. And it can be difficult to navigate that, right? To make the decisions about that. But I think going back to that mission and vision, going back to not just where you want to be in 1 year, right? But where do you want to be in 3? Where do you want to be in 5? Looking at the long-term goals that you have for this organization. Where does all of this fit together?
Yeah, I have a great story about this, actually. So I'm going to go retro about 2015, 16, okay? I understood from my work and my time in the for-profit side that research and patient voice, patient engagement and research was going to be forthcoming. It was, going to be mandated by the government, by regulators, by industry. I knew that this was evolving to that point, but no one was investing in that. No one was paying for that at the time. And it was always that last minute, we can't fill this trial. Could you help us and do it for free?
Right.
Kind of phone call that came in 2015.
We've all gotten those, yes.
So I decided that we were going to put research as a main pillar and begin investing heavily in developing the skills of our staff, and therefore then outreach to our community to be more engaged in research. At the time, research was less than 10% of our overall revenue sources. So my board thought I was crazy. They really did. They thought I was crazy. I was not 100% sure, but I had a pretty good gut feeling that this was going to become more considerate over time. And so we did. And then when I came to GAAPP as the president, we started building that out at GAAPP. And today, that is greater than a quarter to a third of our revenue source is through the research mission pillar. So I think that, it's having a little bit of that vision and foresight and reading the tea leaves and sometimes standing your ground when there are those competing interests or conflicting priorities that really is important in advancing your strategy.
Absolutely. It's such a good example, too. The other thing I am sure now, knowing you and working with you, that you did was your due diligence on that topic. Talking to people in industry, talking to people who were working in this area, right? To see, is this really what the landscape is going to look like? These are not decisions you're making on the fly. These are very intentional, well-researched, well-discussed decisions that you're making with all of your wise people. And I know I have said this 15 times, but it goes back to making sure that you're speaking to all the people who are associated, touch your organization, right? So that you're sure you have the information you need. And so, again, I'm sure that at times that was uncomfortable for you, having those discussions, butting heads in some situations, but I think it is important. I think the other thing that you're sure that you did was to make sure that not every single egg was in that bucket. Right? You didn't say, okay, well, we're going to move everything over to
We're going to stop doing everything else.
That's right.
No.
Right?
No, definitely not.
That, but you are saying, okay, we're going to balance this out. Take some risks, right? Some stretch goals, the moonshots we talked about in part 1, but we'll also be doing all these other things, right, that are directly tied to our mission and vision that we know are on the radar. And that balance, I think, makes people more amenable to it, but I'm not sure what your experience was.
Yeah.
So I think that people will run into that. I think the other thing, and this for me has probably been the biggest thing I've seen people bump up against, is that when you get innovative thinkers in a room, oftentimes you can come out with these beautiful, truly beautiful strategies and goals, but they are disconnected completely from the implementers who have to do the work every day.
Oh, yes. I'm probably guilty of this, actually. Yeah.
I think it happens everywhere,
Yeah.
truly. And I think that can lead then, of course, to people feeling deflated, not connected to their work and that type of thing. So going back to who should be at the table, you must have your implementers there, because if you don't even know if you can do this work.
Yeah.
So that is my sort of other, when developing, I think that's a big pitfall for people. Any others that you think of?
Yeah, I mean, I think in that respect, I always say, and this is not my strong suit, but you have to crawl before you walk, before you run. And I'm always trying to run, right, and go fast and think 2 or 3 steps down the road. And so I think that a lot of times in the strategic planning process, you have to slow down and make sure that you've got those implementers at the table and helping you to think through what is realistic, because otherwise you're going to get unsmart goal, a dumb goal that is not achievable, right?
Yes.
And so I think that that's really good advice, very good advice.
Great. I'm so glad that will be helpful to people, because I think it's a common pitfall for all of us, right? There's nothing wrong with you if you're making this mistake too, the people who are watching, because this happens pretty much everywhere.
Yes.
Being able to catch yourself and then realign, right? So I think when return to executing the strategic plan, I think new priorities are the things that can be a threat. There is something new always, right?
A shiny new toy.
That's right. A day does not go by that there is not something new that comes to your door, and you're making those decisions. Do we engage with this? Where do we go? What do I actually latch on to? And what do we say, not now, not ever, whatever the case is? One of the things that I love to think through are ask myself the question, what is a must do in those moments and what is a nice to have, right? And if you can fit it in with your must do's, maybe you can do this, right? Maybe this new priority can be part of your portfolio, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, it is tempting to always think about new projects, but sometimes in doing that, you lose a bit of your core of what really has made you great to this point. I always say when you say yes to something, you're saying no to something, because there's only so much capacity.
That's right.
Unless you're building capacity within your organization, building out more staff and that sort of thing. There's limited capacity. And so how do we consider the new opportunities in a way that still is within the limited capacity that we have? And if we can't say yes to it, is there someone else? Is there a scaled down version? Is there some other way that the work can be done if it needs to be done, if it excites us, if it aligns with the passion and the vision and the mission of the organization? Just maybe not now.
Exactly. And we can use those big brains for those things, right? To get to that point, to think that through and get to that point.
But it is a challenge.
It is a challenge because things are exciting. And when you are this passionate about helping patients and, again, everybody who touches them, you want to do everything, right? You really do. It's just we don't have unlimited hours or other resources. So you do have to prioritize.
Learning to say no is a hard thing.
It's really hard. Another thing I'll speak to, I love that you spoke to capacity just before. I think team changes are very common over the course of a year, right? People may be out for certain reasons. People may leave to go on to other roles, to other organizations. And a big mistake people will make is they keep going just as if nothing has happened, right? So person A will absorb this, person B will absorb this, and they already had full-time jobs before that team change happened, right? And so I think revisiting with the group, can we still accomplish what we had set out to do here? And then going back to what I had said just a few moments ago about what are the must-dos now and what are the nice-to-haves? And can we do the nice-to-haves while we're in the state that we're in, right? Because these team changes will happen to everyone. You can't escape them.
Change is inevitable.
That's right.
And oftentimes it comes at the worst moments, the busiest times of year, where someone, again, unfortunately gets ill or has to take time off or whatever the case may be, or decides to take another opportunity where, again, selfishly, you're like, this is really going to put a damper on our goals and our aims for this year. But it's smart to step back and to reassess, because otherwise you're going to burn everybody else out.
And yourself, right?
Yeah.
That's inevitable too, just like the changes to the team. Yeah. If you keep going down that road, that will be the inevitable outcome. I think another thing that happens, and this is, again, I think I've seen it happen everywhere, I do it, is you get so excited about doing the work, you're ready to implement now, right? That you don't continue to measure your success. You don't continue to revisit that strategic plan to see how you're doing against those goals that you set. Because you are off to the races, right? I want to go do good things for my community, and you must go back.
Yeah, I have made it a habit for a number of years that, first of all, our strategic planning process, we start mid-year. Mm-hmm. Okay, so for the next year, we're beginning that process in July and August. And then we really lock things down in like early October, so the beginning of Q4, because ours is an annual process. And then we are off to the races in January. And I force myself, in my calendar, to take one day at the end of each quarter and sit with that strategic plan and evaluate and think about where we are, what's changed, what we may need to adjust, have those conversations with my staff, with my board, with different stakeholders. Make sure that you're managing expectations is what I hear you saying.
Yes.
Because there is nothing worse than getting to the end of the year and realizing that you didn't do that well. And you're super disappointed, your board is angry, your staff is frustrated, all these different things. So it's making sure that you're incrementally reevaluating and evaluating how well are we doing and what needs to change.
That's exactly it. And I think also it's managing expectations, but also allowing your team and yourself, I shouldn't make the distinction because we as leaders should be involved in this, to cheer the successes along the way and realign whenever we have lessons learned that we can apply, right? I've seen it with every passionate person, who works in this kind of area, every PAG person. You're just so excited about the work. You go from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, because there's always something to be done for your patients and your community. And you must, I think, to be successful in the long run, ideally, right, is to take that time to say, let's debrief about this. Let's talk, like you said, end of the quarter. Let's talk as a team. Let's talk in our pillars.
But the opposite of that, I've also seen as a struggle with strategic planning, and that is that you do it and then it sits on a shelf.
It's terrible when that
happens. And literally, it's like it never happened. And because I've been part of organizations that has been the case, where it just was like collecting dust.
Yes.
And you revisit it and you're like, did we do anything?
Exactly.
Or did we
work together before?
Yeah. And thankfully, that's not been my experience over the last, number of years.
Right.
I've been doing a lot of that leadership of strategic planning, but I can vividly recall an organization that I was a part of where it was the most frustrating exercise ever to go through weeks and weeks of strategic planning and then never to discuss it again. So that is a challenge as well.
It is completely a challenge. And we must treat these as living documents. We must treat these as sort of the Bibles of our organizations, right? That people have invested in, that they understand their role better because it exists. And we must have it at the forefront. When a new person comes to the organization, do they know where that strategic plan is and where they can access it? I think
is it one of the first documents that you give as an onboarding?
Yeah. Does your community know what you're doing? Right? Are you transparent enough with people other than your board and your own team so that other people know what you're working on, right?
Yeah.
When you live in a culture, when you work in a culture, and we both have worked in places that did adopt these things, so some people are quite good at it. But when you work in a culture where this is celebrated, it is front and center all the time. That doesn't mean every meeting and every day that you're referring back to your strategic plan, because that would be monotonous and boring. But it's really important that it has a life and that it has a presence.
So keeping with that, how do you measure progress on that strategic plan? Because I think this is the key of, again, you've got your SMART goals.
Yes.
You know where you're trying to get to by the end of the year. But how do you incrementally sort of measure how you're doing?
Yes. So I think this is a great question. I think one of the things that you must remember is that if you have the SMART goals, your life will be much easier. To try to measure things out after you have not determined what that will look like in its discrete elements, we broke it down into the SMART. When it doesn't have all those components, you're just putting Band-Aids on it mid-year, and that is not a good place to be. It doesn't feel good, right? And it creates a lot of extra work. I think if you have your SMART goals, you've already determined then what your time frame is. So like you said, it could be a year, it could be 18 months. It's probably better if you're checking in every quarter with people, right? So one of the easiest things that you can do, and it's very low cost and sometimes free, is to create a reporting template for your team. Let's make sure that they have it could be an Excel file. It could be something like a SurveyMonkey survey where they know, okay, she's going to ask us end of Q1 on such and such a date, end of Q2, regularly, she's going to ask us for these outputs and these outcomes. And we know how to enter that. We've been briefed on that, and we will have those data ready for her, right?
I implemented something a few years back that is a key performance indicator scorecard. And I've done this in some years. I had a very extensive one with like 30 different KPIs that I was tracking. I found over time that it's easier and better to limit it, like maybe 10 to 15 real, true, specific, measurable, achievable, timely goals that I can track on a monthly basis. And I do it in the red light system. Red if it needs attention now. Yes. Yellow if I'm tracking and I'm on the right pace to achieve the goal, and green if I'm achieving the goal or ahead of goal. And I use that traffic light system to basically, at a monthly end glance, say, how are we doing? Are we getting there? Are there things that we need to course correct? And so for me, I do that on a monthly basis on those 10 or 15 things. And then on a quarterly basis, going back to the overall strategic plan. Have you seen other things that work?
We've actually used that exact same model in a slightly different way, but it had the same outcomes associated with it. What was great about the stoplight model is that everyone understands what that looks like. It doesn't matter where you're from. It doesn't matter what jobs you've done in the past. It doesn't matter what role you have at the organization. Everybody gets whether they're behind, they're on track, or they're ahead, right?
Yeah.
And at a glance, especially as a leader at the organization, you can see what's happening. Just taking that, I hate this term, but the 10,000-foot view, right? You can see very easily, are we just in a couple of these places falling down where we can then target to, help out these particular pillars or these particular team members? Or do we have something that's maybe more systemic that we need to address? And doing it every month, I think, is so genius, because if you do it every quarter, you're already behind the ball. So yes, I've seen that work really well. And I think that whatever you do, again, it goes back to when you work for a patient advocacy group, you want to do things so well for your patients and you want to do everything. Just make sure this is manageable for your team, right? And then you'll know quickly, I think, if it's not, right? So adopt what works for you, but these are nice starting points, the Excel file, the Survey Monkey, using that approach with the stoplight model. Basic, treat it like something you do as a routine and make it part of a non-negotiable, sort of as part of your culture.
Well, Kristen, we have covered a lot of ground in these two podcasts. I think that, we've given hopefully a foundation to our member organizations of the best practices when it comes to strategic planning. We've got a lot of downloadable resources, but I want to give you a final word because, again, as we come to the end of another calendar year and get ready for strategic planning for 2025, it can be overwhelming. Where do I start? How do I get underway? So what's your final kind of word of encouragement and direction for our members out there?
Oh, yes. I think this is fantastic. It's a nice opportunity to have. So remember, we're speaking to these things as experts because we've been doing them for many years. But I promise you, Tonya and I did not come into this world. We were not born as babies knowing how to do this process. So again, go back to the basics. Start with knowing who's at your table, who you need to have at the table for this conversation. Start with, let's revisit our mission and our vision, and then go to our tools section, download the strategic planning tools that we have, and you will have everything you need to get started.
Well, Kristen, thank you again for your time, for your expertise, for everything that you brought to these two podcasts. And I also want to thank you for your time, for listening in, for tuning in to the Passion for Patients podcast, and for the way that we're standing in the gap for our patient communities. It's truly inspiring to think about what is going to come through this podcast, through this series of podcasts, and the way that it will shape strategic planning for member organizations across the world. As we talked about, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, to share it with others. Absolutely go to GAAPP.org, download the resources, set your calendar dates now for your strategic planning session, and don't forget that we're here to help. And until we see you again, stay passionate.